Good evening, everybody, and welcome very much to tonight's webinar, all about attention to detail and what to measure to manage. We've got a great lineup of speakers joining us this evening. Just to kick off, I'm going to run through a few housekeeping points. If you wouldn't mind just going on one more slide, please, Michelle. Basis and Neroso points are available for tonight's webinar. If you would please just pop your details in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. If you add your name, number and postcode, we can pick these up and sign in for your points. You are all on mute this evening. We can't hear you, but please, as always, if you have any questions, pop those into that question box on the right-hand side too. And I will field these to our speakers on your behalf. The plan of action for tonight, it's an hour's webinar. We do tend to find that we go over 10 minutes every time, no matter how hard we try. But we've got 4 really interesting speakers to go through this evening with some wonderful knowledge to pass on to all of you. So just to introduce our speakers for this evening, hopefully you can all see them on the screen now. We've got Roger Sylvester Bradley and Christina Baxter joining us from ADAS, and then Gary Willoughby, who is our Wainfleet monitor farmer, and Mike Parker, who's our Vale of Beaver monitor farmer, both of which are participants within YEN. And I'm going to talk an awful lot more about what they do on their farm and how they work with their farming system. And then Roger and Christina will discuss how YEN fits in with this. So if we just go on one more slide, please, Michelle. I just want to mention, while you are all waiting, I'm sure you'll have seen this before you joined the webinar, but it's your chance to have your say and vote for AHDB's Shape the Future of Farming. The vote will open as of the middle of April, but in order to participate within that, you've got to register your details. So please, if you could head over to our website, ahdb.org.uk/shape the future, and add your details onto our website there. We will then have you ready within that validation process. And as of April, you will be able to vote towards the future of your levy and which direction you would like AHDB to go towards. Thank you. If you could go on to the next slide, please, Michelle. So I've introduced all of our speakers this evening. If I get this right, hopefully I've lined all these slides up, and I'm going to hand over to Gary first, who's going to talk through what happens with his farm and how he uses detail in that farming system. Thank you very much, Gary.
Thank you, Rose. And yeah, welcome everybody to tonight's webinar. As it says here, Gary Willoughby over at Wainfleet Monitor Farm, and here's my little team and a little map just showing where we are. So drier part of the country to many. Yeah, we're at sort of sea level out on the marsh here, just in from Skegness. So good strong sort of wheat growing land, some would say. And next slide, please. So yeah, all combinable cropping. There is a history of livestock on the farm, but nothing at the moment. Although straw does go off and manure comes back onto the farm, so that's all good. We're into our 2nd year of direct drilling from a plough-based system previously, silty clays to silty clay loams, and a sort of good healthy 5 to 8% organic matter on our soils. Pretty varied rotation, but these all figure in here somewhere. So winter wheat, winter oilseed rape, winter beans, spring barley, spring linseed. With plenty of blackgrass available on the farm, so a good sort of rotation, winter cropping, spring cropping, cereals and others. Yeah, all add into the mix. And like I say, we're not ploughing anymore, so by Christmas, by the end of October, we like to see everything drilled with either cash crop or into a cover crop. Cover crops sort of bit new to us over the last couple of years, but learning all the time on that one. And next slide, please. So this was as part of the monitor farm process. ADAS came and did some soil sampling. First time we'd ever gone to this depth on soil sampling. Before it was your sort of standard analysis, and first time we'd seen anything like this just a couple of years ago. So really interesting to see. We were quite pleased with our organic matters. We knew we'd got a good strong clay content. pHs we were used to seeing, and sort of your PKs and mags, what we'd seen before. And yeah, so this was new to us. The sort of the VEST scoring as well was quite interesting to see it done on farm. Obviously I've seen it on a webinar beforehand, but to actually see it done on farm by guys doing it sort of several days a week was really interesting as well. So this is sort of a bit of a starting point for us of measuring what's going on farm as far as growing crops, but it's also turning out that as sort of we get into carbon trading and that sort of thing, inputting data into farm carbon toolkit, that all becomes relevant as well, organic matters and such. So yeah, there's lots of data here, but it starts building a picture for us. So not a great history of this sort of in-depth soil sampling, but it's sort of starting to build a picture for us. And next slide, please. So Harvest 20 was our first dabble in yen nutrition. So as the combines roll in, we sort of keep grabbing handfuls of grain from across the field and put it in a bucket, stir it all up, put a sample in a bag and send it off to the lab to be tested. And this is just a small part of sort of what came back of that grain analysis. So like I say, never sort of seen anything quite like this before. Usually on farm, the only nutrients we're using are nitrogen and sulfur in a liquid form, and that's it. We've got a healthy P and K, largely due to the muck going back on, plenty of magnesium, and everything else was sort of left to its own devices and to take a chance. So to see sort of what we're getting here was really interesting. Yeah, most things look pretty good. Bit of manganese, sort of middle bottom diagram there. Manganese on the oilseed rapes looking a little bit low. Nearer the outside is low, nearer the middle is high. So yeah, that was something to watch. Something I'd been sort of thinking about. People talk about manganese, sort of splash quite a bit on, but I was thinking, don't need to worry about that. But here we can see that actually the seed sample is looking a little bit low. And also on the oilseed rapes, even though we're putting sort of sulfur on with the nitrogen, there's a drip feed every time we go through, we can see that that's even slightly low as well. But yeah, maybe sort of start to think about tailoring a nutrition program on the back of this. So next slide, please. So this was for Harvest 21. This was a winter wheat crop. And this is just a really small part of the yen report that came off the back of that. So like I say, Harvest 20, we did the yen nutrition. For Harvest 21, we were taking a soil sample, these leaf samples, and sort of building a much more of a picture, really. So here's just, like I say, just a small part of it. But we can see on the top sort of graph here, manganese right from the end of tillering, the sort of 4 sample stages that we took, manganese again below average right through. And this hadn't had anything added to the mix. I thought, well, we'll sort of go through as we had done in any other year, not add anything extra in, just the nitrogen and sulfur, and see what it throws up. So we can see right from start to finish, we were short on manganese. So that's definitely something to sort of think about going forward. The other one that I sort of picked up on was the calcium. Yeah, I don't know that much about adding in calcium, to be fair, but it's something it's obviously low here, so it's somewhere that we need to investigate. And is it sort of being locked up by other nutrients that we've got too much of? All these things we've got to sort of try and fathom out. But if we hadn't have sort of done the leaf testing, we wouldn't know that these are our possible sort of limiting factors and things we need to start having a look at. Maybe even sort of doing a split field trial where we have no manganese and then we add in manganese and hopefully see a difference, and ultimately see a difference in yield and sort of margin over cost as well. Obviously that's as farmer, that's key to it. So pretty new to this, and starting to build a picture, which is what it's all about. And next slide, please. Yeah, so that's it. We like I say, new to the leaf testing and the sort of yen program, but starting to build a picture. And I'm gonna be listening to our sort of speakers later on and trying to learn as much from them as we can. It's really interesting when you understand why they're testing various bits of the crop, that you start to sort of build a picture and see where they're coming from. So that's where we are at Wainfleet Monitor Farm. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Gary. I did just have one question come through, or one question with two parts anyway. Aside from the detail that you have got from Yen, do you use any other labs for your information and sampling, and how much does it cost?
I don't. No, I don't do any other sort of soil sampling, sort of soil sampling or leaf testing or anything. It's all, so far it's all been done through Yen. Yeah. We'd had sort of regular soil tests done before that, but that was a sort of part of our fertilizer program. I buy their fertilizer and they do my soil sampling, sort of thing. Yeah, we've not paid for and not done any other sort of in-depth testing beforehand. It's all sort of through the Monitor Farm sort of program that we've got this learning process going on.
No, that's great. Thank you very much, Gary. And I think, if I'm right, Roger will touch on a bit more, Roger and Christina will touch on a bit more about the yen sampling process. Thank you, Gary. That was great. So without further ado, if we click some right buttons, I'm now going to hand over to Mike Parker, who, as I said, is our Vale of Beaver monitor farmer. And Mike's just going to chat through what happens at Sherwood Farms there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, so I am Mike Parker. I farm with my father, James Parker. We're East Midlands based. But if we go to the next slide, please. So a bit, some of our farm, we're 630 hectares, split into 3 blocks, about 10 miles apart, predominantly heavy clay, with the rest a makeup of clay loams, sandy loams, and a few loamy sands. Of that's 560 hectares of arable. We're quite diverse, so we have chickens both free range and colonies. That's important tonight because we get 2,100 tons of manure from that. And we also run a composting business, which we set up on our light land farm. So one of our blocks is a light land just outside Nottingham. And historically, that was always sort of very low organic matter, struggled to hold any nutrients of any kind, really. So that compost was set up in 2003, so 19 years later the organic matters have jumped up sort of 4 or 5%, which is excellent. It's transformed the land, really. So we do that, and then we've got a few other bits on farm, but nothing else relevant for tonight? I don't think. Next slide, please. So arable wise, what are we doing? We're fairly standard. We just grow cereals, combinables. So we don't have a fixed rotation. It changes a bit to suit what weed pressure we have more than anything. But an ideal sort of way we do it is wheat, winter beans, to wheat, spring barley, linseed. But then, so we've also been dabbling in a few others. So sort of starting from the top, winter wheat areas up this year because we got a bit more drilled, which was lovely. That's sort of because we had a load of land that we couldn't drill last year that went into some beans. So it's just fallen nicely to go into wheat. To barley, we've dropped entirely in favour of spring barley this year. Two reasons: one, reduced pressure for oilseed rape ground, to be clear, and secondly, blackgrass. We just sort of 6 years ago we'd never grown a spring crop, and now we are about towards a 50% spring cropping, that kind of level, about 200 hectares, of which it's all grown in cover crops beforehand. Oilseed rate we dropped entirely. 18-19 we lost £200 per hectare on average. 19-20 110 hectares planted, 0 combined. Again, we didn't do the maths on how much that lost because it's too scary. And 2021, surprisingly enough, dropped from the rotation. Linseed, we are making good money at that now. We've effectively used that to replace our oilseed rape area. However, we're also, so we do a spring barley and then we do another one, so it's spring linseed generally, but we're also dabbling, if you like, in, so we've been doing millet, and we've done it for 2 years and we've lost money on that for 2 years. So we won't be growing that again this year. However, we did grow lupins last year and we did make a bit of money at that, so it's not as much as linseed, but we're trying again. And with lupins we have the advantage that we can feed them to our chickens, so they work very well for us. I should say that we're sort of all switching to, or we're switching to direct drilling, so that drill in the picture there is being switched out for a Horizon DSX direct drill, right or wrong. Next slide, please. So what are we doing with yen? Next slide, please. I'm just going to give you a bit of a summary as to how we use it and how we're sort of developing it as a farm. So we're already tissue testing on all of our crops every year, and we're sort of using yen as a method to improve how we treat that data. So we're tissue testing, we're soil testing, and we're grain testing. The grain testing through yen, which we'll come to, but the cereal yen, which is your whole crop all the way through, we're not using it as a maximum yield experiment. Not experiment, but a maximum yield challenge. We're using it as a learning process. So we will do an entire field and we will treat it exactly the same as any other field, other than we'll properly record it and submit it to yen. So then this allows it to be comparable to the rest of our farm, theoretically, meaning that we can gain more from it. And I've said that, and I put on the right that our potential yield was 130th out of the candidates, and we did get 110th. So I will take that. That's good in competition terms, but not bad for an average crop, I don't think. And then we're also using yen nutrition, which we'll come to. So next slide, please. So what do we get back from yen? Well, this is just a little bit of, it's a big old document and you can take as much or as little of it as you like, but for the sake of tonight, I pulled out these few bits. So what you're looking at on the right hand side is the results of our grain data, which were proving the most interesting. And on the left is the summary that you get at the end as to specific bits that you can do for your crop. So quickly looking through it. Basically, the first one, your yield arose from a low total biomass and a normal harvest index. So I take that as our yield wasn't too bad. And our line interception by annual crops was pretty good, 62% achieved. On to the bits that I think we can do a bit more with, crop nutrition. So the grain N of this crop was low for KWSX days. So perhaps we didn't have an adequate supply of N, although the results are showing that the protein and uptake were all right or sort of average. So we'll look at that because we do N testing. We have a SAP tester and we use satellite maps as well. So we'll just perhaps look at doing a trial. This is what I mean. You can use it to tinker with your system, and we'll use that to tinker, and we might do a bit more on a plot just to see what we can gain. Your soil P was 14 versus 17, so slightly surprised by that one because we tend to have very high P and K levels on our farm as a result of our long-term compost and poultry manure. I should say the poultry manure that we've had has been going on for 70 years in that region of time. So our indices are 4s and 5s in places, which is scary. So we tend to have the opposite problem in that we have lockup of different nutrients. But so that's something that we can perhaps look at for this particular field. It's further away from the farm, so again, learning, send poultry muck to this farm, to this field. Our N to sulfur ratio greater than 17, so we had sulfur deficiency. Again, we have different with liquid nitrogen. We could put a higher sulfur-based nitrogen there, or put a bit of foliar sulfur. Again, a little thing that we can learn. And your grain is estimated to have 13. So manganese is a consistent problem for us. So it's low there, and let's just think on that. If we go to the next slide, please. So what we have here is, this is our grain testing called Yen Nutrition, if you've not done it, and this is what Gary was showing you a minute ago. And our results, you'll notice a bit all over the shop, primarily because we've done a whole load of weird crops that aren't as well understood, and the values are slightly harder to determine. But the principles that you'll notice, our manganese is low everywhere, pretty well, bar one field of triticale. So we'll definitely be paying extra attention to that. And we tend to get a bit of potassium lockup, but it's not showing that in any of these. So you would say that it's not a year to worry. I think that perhaps that late wet weather last summer helps. But all that you really, or how we use it, is we'll pick out these certain bits that we've slipped up on these fields last year. So take the first top left, linseed, sulfur was low, manganese was low, and phosphate was low. Those were the ones that I would take into account. Molybdenum, calcium, and boron, a bit more tricky. But yeah, we'll then tinker with this data and use it to go forward, and that's sort of how we use it and get the most out of it. And yeah, that's it. Next slide should be me done.
Thank you very much, Mike. That was great and really quite interesting, and there's so much to look at, isn't there? And I don't know where you start half the time with some of it. So without further ado, and hopefully Roger's going to help explain part of that for us, as well as give us an introduction to Yen and building a farm-specific understanding. Thank you very much, Roger.
Thank you, Rose, and hopefully you'll tell me if you can't hear me. Thank you very much, Rose. Rose is a great believer in the yen, and in fact, AHDB is a great believer in the yen, and I'm pretty sure it's not because it's a competition. So the aspect that we're going to try and emphasize, Christina and I are going to speak about yen and sort of explain to any of the uninitiated what the yen is trying to do. We're going to emphasize, you know, the bits that Gary and Michael have both just emphasized, which is basically measuring to manage. I mean, you know, in any arena, you need to measure in order to manage. So that goes without saying. But what we're trying to do in the yen is measure the most important things. And the phrase that has come out of doing all that, I mean, the yen's now in its 10th year, which is, to me, I helped start the yen, and it's an astonishing thing that's happened, that it's sort of grown, and we've got lots of developments of the yen, which I'll come back to at the end. But what we want to start at the beginning about is having had that really nice introduction of two farms that are just getting into doing all these extra measurements, just to try and explain the background of how we've come to that. So when I look at a landscape like this, this happens to be Northumberland, but it's A, beautiful, B, it looks very tidy. C, I know, because I've been working for ADAS for over 40 years, that it's got lots of intelligent people who are making lots of observations. But I also know there's lots of variation. And my job as a scientist is try to understand that variation. And I've been doing small plot trials, for decades, but I really don't understand what's happening, or I didn't before the yen, what was happening at the farm scale out there. And I couldn't see the patterns in there. And there are things there that we can control, and there are things there that we can't control. And the crucial thing, I think, for management is to see past the things like the season and the weather that you can't control, to see the things that you can control. And so that's our main ambition with the yen. And the fact that it's a competition is just, the first yen happened to focus on yield. We called it the yield enhancement network, but in fact, yen is now applied separately to nutrition, to carbon footprinting, and I'll come back to that at the end. So the yen is just a way of working, and we use the competition just to make sure we were getting yields that everybody trusted, all the members of the yen would trust. So they're all Weybridge yields. I mean, other yields are submitted, but they don't qualify for the competition. And it is possible to be part of the yen without competing formally at all. But so what I want to do now is just to sort of show you the structure of the yen, the philosophy of the yen, and we have to. It's a knowledge building exercise. So. And it's a community exercise as well. So we've not only got farmers like Gary and Michael, we've got their advisors, we've got the AHDB, which obviously supports farming and from a farmer's point of view. We've got laboratories which are very enthusiastically involved. We've got manufacturers and suppliers of all the inputs, and we, as well as people like Christina and me, who are applied scientists and trying to understand what is going on so that we can help everybody make progress. So what we need to begin with, I mean, we can't deny everything that we've learned at college, and so we start with what we know, and what we know dictates what we need to measure. So, and Christina's going to come and talk through what we do measure in the yens, so I won't go into that any more detail, but and Christina will also show how we do benchmarking. But the benchmarking is a crucial element of this, because from a single farm's point of view, it's not very easy to see your own values of whatever you measure in context, unless you have lots of trustworthy measurements from your neighbors and from people who are in a similar situation. So that's what the benchmarking is trying to do. And then when you've got all these measurements, you're bound to, you'll see some things that are as expected, and as Michael and Gary were just talking about, things that they noticed that they were unexpected, and they all get reported in these voluminous long reports, 24 pages with over 100 measurements, all benchmarked. So it goes right through the growing system, as Christina will show you. But when you've done all that, you're going to notice things that you probably need to do. And Michael's already talked about needing more attention to manganese on his farm. Those are the sorts of things that we're trying to identify at the farm level, so that you can improve them one by one, and ideally identify the most important thing. And then I'm not going to talk about this, but once you've had your ideas, whether it's a new product or a new timing of a product or a new implement or even a new system, you need to do some testing. And we've got very much in the Yen philosophy, we're trying to do experimentation now at the field scale, so in tramline trials, and we're doing hundreds of tramline trials now. We're not going to talk about that anymore, but if you're interested in doing tramline trials, there's a free guide on the Yen website, so you can see the pitfalls of doing your own trials and how to do the best trials. But we're dead keen to explain to everybody and try and help them do their own trials. And then, of course, when we've got the results of that, we need a mechanism for feeding it back into the knowledge base. And I'm going to come to a new initiative that tries to think about that process into the future. But just to sort of quickly summarize the results so far, in the first 8 years of the Yen, this analysis has only done considered 8 years up to 2020. We've got something like 1,500 cereal yields, and those cereal yields are giving us a lot of information. There's a huge potential to analyze relationships between things in that database, and the sorts of the variation we've got in yield is big. It's from 5 or 6 tons to 15 or 16 tons. So it's a huge variation, and there's lots of factors involved in that variation, of course, because people are joining the Yen from all different parts of the UK. In fact, 10% of Yen members come from abroad, Ireland, and from the mainland Europe, and particularly Scandinavia and Holland. We've actually got Yens in North America, but at the moment they're not included in the same database. And the sorts of measurements we take, first of all, are to do with the things that farmers do, so the sort of empirical relationships between what's supplied and what's harvested. But we also, because we're crop physiologists and we feel we understand as best as anyone how yields are determined, that we also take some measurements to help us work out how the yields were determined. But when we do the analysis, the thing that's come through stronger than anything else is the farm factor. And so a quarter of all that variation from 5 to 15 or whatever it is, a quarter of that variation is associated with farm to farm differences. And that's after we've taken out the soil type effect and the rotational effect and all the agronomy effects. So there is something about the farm, and this is giving us a complete conviction that the Yen is the way forward, because we're all about farmers sharing and learning. That's what the Yen is about, sharing your observations, your data, your ideas, and learning. And you're not going to do it unless you can sort of try and understand how you relate to all the other farms. So, and this is just an example of, I think there's 18 farms there that have entered in 5 or more years in the first 8 years of the yen, and you can see the range of yield there is over 5 tons per hectare. And I'm sorry, but we don't fully understand why this is there. It's big. We don't know all the factors that cause it, because we're taking physiological measurements, but we're not so far associating physiological measurements with farmed differences. But I'd just like to contrast, you know, we pay so much attention to wheat genetics. I'm talking about the wheat variation here. I'm not including the other cereals or any of the other crops. But you know, the recommended list at the moment has a range of yields of 1.1 tons per hectare. We have a range of yields on the farm across years of more than 5 tons per hectare. Huge variation. There's so much to learn and so much improvement to make. And with that, I'd like to pass over to Christina, who will hopefully seamlessly be able to take over the presentation.
Okay, brilliant. So hopefully everybody can see my screen okay. So thank you very much, Roger, for the seamless link. So I'm going to focus down on a few specific elements of the yield enhancement networks, which provide the foundation for that metrics component that Roger talked about within that 4 pillars diagram. So this will include talking about what we measure within the different yield enhancement networks, so specifically what sort of data we collect from yen entrants and how we use it to understand the environment the crop was grown in, how it was managed, and how the yield was formed. I'll talk about how we benchmark this data and the value of that benchmarking exercise in terms of allowing yen entrants to compare themselves against other growers in the network within that same season, comparing themselves against the AHDB benchmarks where we have them from the growth guides, and also known critical values where we know that if you're performing below these specific critical values from the literature, then it's likely to be having a detrimental effect on your yield. And then finally, I'll talk about the yield potential element of the yens and how we calculate yield potential and why we calculate yield potential, why we see it as a useful tool to include within our yield enhancement networks. So we collect a lot of data from each entrant and from each crop that's entered into the yield enhancement network. And this is both data that's provided by the entrants themselves and also samples that are collected from the fields and the crop, which give us a really good picture of how the crop has developed through the season and how the yield was formed and what might be limiting that yield, as Gary and Mike talked about at the start. And as a yen entrant, the amount of information you give to us essentially equates to the amount of information you get back. So as a yen entrant, it's up to you how much information you provide. Some of it's mandatory for us to calculate things like yield potential and final yields, but others are out of choice. And we hope that the more information you give us, the more we can give back to you. So to help you understand the sorts of data that we collect through the season, over the winter and early spring, we send out samples to each yen entrant, which allows them to collect soil. We send out packs to each yen entrant, which allows them to collect soil samples from their fields. This is sent to NRM for a soil health analysis, so it measures nutrient contents in the soil and key soil parameters. And the entrants get back a report produced by NRM, but we also benchmark this data within which is provided to the entrants in the yen harvest report. Roger mentioned that we collect agronomy information, so this includes information about cultivations used, the variety grown, the seed rate, the inputs, the ag chemicals and the fertilizers used, and other parameters. We also get a description of the soil of the entry field in terms of its soil depth, its stoniness and its texture. And this allows us to calculate the soil water holding capacity for that particular site. There's a few time points during the season where entrants are able to collect leaf tissue samples. And these are sent over to Landcrop to analyse for the 12 essential nutrients, and it just allows us to monitor the crop during the season for potential nutrient limitations that you may be able to act on during the season as well. We use the location information that the entrants provide us to source weather data from DTN. So this includes daily solar radiation and rainfall information. And we summarise this data in the end of season report. So entrants are able to determine how weather might have influenced and affected their yield. But we also use this weather information to calculate our yield potentials. Specifically for cereal yen entries, later on in the season, we ask for an overhead image of the crop with an A4 sheet of paper laid on top. And some people might think, what's the A4 sheet of paper for? But essentially, it provides us a scale for that image in order to determine the amount of ears in a metre squared. But it also gives us a visual picture of what the crop looks like, how well the canopy is developed, and the density of ears in that crop. And then finally, moving on to harvest time. Pre-harvest, we send out packs to each entrant to allow them to collect a pre-harvest grab sample. And this is essentially a collection of tillers or plants, depending on the crop, that's collected across the entry area. And it's sent over to AHDB, which we analyse for a number of different yield components. And we also collect a grain sample from each yen crop, where we analyse for the essential nutrients and nutrient offtake. And we also look at grain size and morphology to better understand how well those grains were filled. And finally, we collect harvest area and weight that was harvested to allow us to calculate final yield. So we do collect a lot of data throughout the season, but as I mentioned before, it does give us a really good idea of how the crop's developing over the season, how the yield was formed, and what might have been limiting that yield as well. So for instance, the combination of soil, tissue and grain nutrient analysis give us a full picture of nutrition through the season to allow us to see if any parts of the nutrition might have been limiting the crop and the specific points where that nutrition might have been limited as well. And we can understand the limitations both by using those critical values that we have from the literature where they're available, but also just through that benchmarking process, as Gary really nicely showed. Just by comparing yourself against other crops in the same season, you can see if your nutrients may have been limiting. The agronomy information we collect is really important for our yen database. It's really valuable to help us to better understand what the main influencing factors are in terms of management regimes that are conducive to high yields. And we collect information about crop development, so when the crop is reaching specific growth stages, and the time period within those growth stages as well helps us to determine how development might have either limited yields or contributed to improved yields. So things like knowing when the crop emerged, knowing when it senesced and when it was harvested can help us understand potential limitations in growth. So I mentioned the soil description and weather data allow us to calculate potential yields, and the harvested area and weight allow us to calculate final yield achieved. And it's the grab and grain sample that's a really key element of the data and the samples that we collect from each crop, because it gives us a really valuable amount of information about how the specific yield was formed to get us to a better idea of what might have limited that yield or contributed to its improved yield. And the grab sample itself, what we measure is listed here, and it essentially gives us an idea of the size of the crop and how that biomass was distributed across the major yield components, which include total biomass, shoot number, weight of each shoot, height, spikelet number, the weight of the grain number in terms of unit area, and also grain number per ear, and the harvest index as well. And as Roger said, the yen's been going for 10 years now, and collecting this data has shown us that high yields come from crops that are large. They come from large crops that have a high above ground biomass, have a high number of ears in a unit area, and also are taller as well. So we use all this information and we present it in these box plots, and this is what's demonstrated on this slide here. And the box plots allow us to benchmark your data as a yen entrant against other entries within that same data set and that same season. And the box plot shown here, you can see that it allows us to show where the lowest yen value sits for that crop in that season and the highest yen value as well. So you can see the range in the data. The box itself shows the middle 50% of yen values, and the line shows the median, the middle yen value in that data set. And then we overlay the critical value in red, where we know that performing lower than this critical value is likely to negatively impact yield, and the AHDB benchmark in blue. And for the wheat crops in particular, the AHDB benchmark represents what's needed to achieve a crop of 11 tonnes per hectare. And then most importantly, we put your value on the top of this box plot, so you can see if you're achieving at the higher end of the data set or at the lower end below the critical value where we have it. So it just allows that key comparison point that Roger talked about, both against the data set and data like the benchmark and critical values where we have them. So these box plots are presented in a unique report which goes out to each yen entrant at the end of the season. And it's a really large document that Gary and Mike touched upon. It's 24 pages long. We provide data on benchmark data on yield and percentage of yield achieved, and also more than 100 explanatory metrics. So it's a really good resource to keep coming back to. We don't see it as people being able to digest and fully understand it in one sitting, but as a resource that you can keep coming back to during the season to question certain things and reflect on how you performed in the season before for certain parameters. So we do see it as a repetitive process, and previous yen entrant quotes is the best thing about the yen is the report, and that they probably read theirs a dozen times each year. Just to demonstrate how you can use these benchmark box plots and the yen report to understand how yield was formed and what might have been limiting yield, I've just put some box plots together for a yen entry, a winter wheat crop in the 2020 harvest season. And you can see it produced a very respectable yield of 9.6 tonnes per hectare, just below the average of the data set. And it did this by producing a below average above ground biomass of 14 tonnes per hectare, but a high conversion of this biomass into final yield with a harvest index of 61%. And if we focus down onto the specific yield components, you can see that the crop itself produced a very respectable number of ears above the AHDB benchmark. It produced over 500 ears in a metre squared. And it managed to set a very high number of grains of over 31,000 grains in a metre squared. So this is telling us that the conditions during grain set were very good and conducive to good grain set. And the nutrition in the crop must have been good enough to allow the crop to produce this number of grains. Then if we move on to look at the grain size and morphology, we can see that the crop struggled to fill this number of grains that it produced. So 1,000 grain weight was very low at 31 grams, close to the critical value, and grain length and width were low as well. And so we know that grain length is set before grain width, so it's likely that grain fill was constrained throughout this period. And reflecting on this data and reflecting on the benchmarking box plots, the grower could think about trying to improve canopy health at this later stage of the season to ensure that the crop's still intercepting a good amount of light later on in the season to produce resources that can help to fill those grains, and where possible delaying senescence to ensure that that light interception is being increased to fill the grains that the crop produced. We have a guide to digesting the yen report because we appreciate it's a lot of data to take in, and this is a circular process which starts with the headline performance. So what yield did you achieve? How do you compare to others in the network? And what was your potential yield? So how did the weather affect your potential yield? And then moving on to looking at your growing conditions in terms of your soil, your soil parameters and soil nutrition, and was there enough water available to your crop provided by that soil. And looking at your variety choice and agronomy, comparing these parameters against others in the network and thinking about whether there was any elements which could be improved. And moving on to crop development. So what was the length of each phase of growth? Because we know that slow development means more growth within each phase, which means more biomass and more yield. And then we can look at the capture of resources, so light and water capture and nutrient capture using those leaf tissue samples collected through the season. And then finally looking at yield analysis, so crop structure, thinking about those yield components measured in the pre-harvest grab sample, and the seed size and morphology, so understanding how well the grains that you set were filled. And finally, nutrition post-mortem, which Roger's going to talk about in a few slides' time, so looking at nutritional offtake and understanding whether there were potentially any nutrients that were limiting. So I'll move on to yield potential now, and how we calculate yield potential and why we calculate yield potential within the yen networks. And Roger mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that there's good capacity within our farms in the UK to improve average on-farm yields, and we see yield potential as acting as a target for yen entrants to boost their yields up to. And it also provides a level playing field. So within the competition element of the yen networks, we provide an award for percentage of potential yield achieved. And it means that those growers that are growing on soil or in an environment that's not conducive to high yields, that they can also compete essentially. So the way we calculate yield potential is we essentially simplify yield down into the capture and conversion of the resources of solar radiation and water. And the yield potentials, even though we have had yen entrants in the past that have achieved higher than their yield potential, we do find that our yield potential figures are higher than what's being achieved on farm. And this is because the physiology of a potential yielding crop, although the different components have been achieved and measured in crops in the past, they haven't been achieved in a single crop, so they haven't been combined together. So an element of being able to achieve these potential yields consistently on farm is we do need improved varieties to do that. But as I mentioned, the yield potentials are there to simplify the understanding that yield is formed by the capture of solar radiation and water, and to give that target as well. So our yield potential models are split into two different models, which is essentially the amount of potential yield that can be achieved with the light availability and the amount of potential yield that can be achieved with the water available. And we essentially take the lowest of these two values to get to a final yield potential. And this also helps us to understand whether the crop might have been light or water limited in that particular season. So thinking about the light limited model, we essentially assume how much light or to calculate how much light the crop can intercept by modelling the canopy size and green area cover over the season. So this graph here shows the green area index on a daily basis throughout the season. And we use this GAI to calculate the percentage of light that the crop can intercept. And this graph shows a typical solar radiation within the UK over the season on a daily basis from September all the way through to the following September, and it follows this pattern, which indicates that if you can manage to keep your canopies greener for longer and delay that senescence, there's a high amount of solar radiation available to that crop at the back end of the season in August and early September that can contribute to yield because it improves that grain fill period. So if we compare a potential yielding crop against a benchmark crop in terms of the percentage of light intercepted, you can start to see how our potential yielding crop differs from an average crop. And the differences, the two main differences are that we're assuming that the canopy expansion is much greater earlier on in the season, and that senescence is delayed at the back end of the season. So at these two time points in the season, the crop is intercepting more light than the benchmark. And this essentially equates to the potential yielding crop intercepting 60% of the light it has available to it over the growing season, whereas the benchmark yielding crop intercepts 47% light. Also, within our potential yield model, we assume a more efficient conversion of this solar radiation into biomass. So we assume that potential yielding crop can convert 1 terajoule of light into 1.4 tonnes per hectare of biomass, whereas the benchmark crop produces 1.2 tonnes per hectare for a terajoule of biomass. So moving on to the water limited model, we use the rainfall data we source from DTN and the soil description provided from each yen entrant to get to the total amount of water available to those crops. And the rainfall data we use is from April all the way through to July, because before that period, we're assuming that the soils are filled to full capacity. So to get to that figure of the soil water holding capacity, we use the information provided by yen entrants on soil texture, soil depth, and stone content. So the soil depth allows us to understand how far the roots of that crop can root down to, and the stone content helps us to understand what proportion of the soil profile is stone and therefore can't hold water. And the soil texture we collect both for the topsoil, the top 30 centimetres, and the subsoil as well. And so within that calculation of total water availability, we assume that the crop can capture 75% of the water down to 2 metres depth, unless the yen entrants tell us that their soils are actually shallower than this. And then again, as I mentioned, that we use the rainfall on top of this from April and July. And with this total water available to the crop, we again assume a more efficient conversion of that water to final biomass of 5.5 tonnes per hectare being able to be achieved for each 100 mil of water collected. And whereas the benchmark is 5 tonnes per hectare for each 100 mil. And so within this water limited model, that soil description that the yen entrant provides is really key, that it's as accurate as it possibly can be, because it's determining how much water we think is available to that crop. And texture is a big influence on this, because we know that clay and silt soils hold a lot more soil and hold a lot more water and retain that moisture as well, compared to sands that are very porous and then the water flows through quickly. So these are the box plots we present in the yen reports that are relevant to the available water to the crops, which includes the soil water holding capacity, the rainfall from April to July, and the sum of these essentially equals the total water available to that crop. And then we use the biomass that we measure from the pre-harvest grab sample to estimate how much water that crop used. And from that box plot here, you can see that for some yen entries, we do calculate that more than 100% of the water available to that crop was used. And this happens for a couple of reasons. The first being that for some soils, we don't have a good hold and a good understanding of how much water that soil can hold, particularly for shallow, chalky soils. But another element is that soil description provided by the yen entrants isn't entirely accurate, maybe due to the texture not being correct, but more likely down to the depth and the stoniness of that soil not being fully correct. So that's why it's important to dig soil pits where you can to better understand your soils in terms of how much water it can hold, how far the roots are getting down to, and the density of those roots, to see especially if those roots could potentially be limited in places as well due to compaction or lack of biopores. So once we get to a biomass figure of potential yield, whether it be the light or water limited biomass, depending on which figure's lower, we then use a figure of 60% harvest index to get to a final yield potential. And the maps here show our calculated yield potentials for the 2021 harvest season. So on the left to right, you've got winter wheat crop on a retentive soil, winter wheat crop on a light soil, and then a spring sown cereal crop on a light soil as well. And you can see for the majority of potential yields across the UK are between 14 and 19 tonnes per hectare, with the southwest of the UK tending to have a higher yield potential. So this is also showing us that the potential yields across the UK, it's achievable to boost yields at anywhere in the UK. So we do see the potential yields as a valuable element within the yen networks to provide that target for each entrant to aim towards. So I'll now hand over to Roger, who will talk more about the specific yen networks.
Thanks, Christina. Hopefully everybody can now see a slide with all the yens on. I mean, what Christina's just said is very important, that basically there's masses more that we can do to enhance yields. And, you know, what people seem to think yields sort of are unfashionable, but in fact they do control profitability, they control resource use efficiency. So it's a very important measurement for us to, and target for us to try and enhance for all sorts of reasons, both economic and environmental, as well as sort of social as well. Most of the yens, and these symbols, these logos are for all the different yield yens. Most of the yens unashamedly address yield primarily, but we have come to realize that the way we're working is applicable to other questions, and particularly to nutrition and to carbon footprinting. So in the last couple of years, we've started yens on both those things. I'm slightly worried about time, so I'm going to, unless Rose tells me otherwise, I'm just going to sort of try and be as fast as I can through the next, it's about 5 more slides. So yen nutrition and yen zero are addressing obviously nutrition and carbon footprinting, and then farm PEP is bringing it all together. Basically, I showed that diagram that we call our 4 pillars diagram that does the cycle from knowledge back to improved knowledge, and somehow we have to have a way we've got so many challenges in this century that we've got to be able to change faster, but with confidence. So we get that confidence because there's so many of us, if we can share the information. So the idea is to bring that knowledge together in what we call farm PEP. But just to quickly explain about yen nutrition, we realize that one of the things that seems to differ between farms is their nutritional status. So we set up a couple of years ago, 2020, yen nutrition because to address more than 1 field per farm, so that we do 6 or more fields per farm, and we ask for much less information. We don't take any grab samples, we just take a grain sample, analyze that grain sample, and we ask for the agronomy information that we need that are associated with nutrition. And from that, we can provide pretty thorough reports about the nutrition of your crops. First of all, as soon as the analysis of the grain comes back, we can tell you, and that you've told us about your yield, and it doesn't have to be a Weybridge yield, just your best estimate. We can tell you how much nutrients you're taking off your land, and that's very important for managing your P&K. We can then later in the year, when it's sort of around about the middle of winter, we can, when we've got all the data, we can benchmark your results against everybody else, and we look at the concentrations and tell you, and those were the target diagrams that Michael and Gary were showing earlier, were the benchmark, part of the benchmarking report. This is another part of the benchmarking report. It's just presenting the same data in a different way, but this is similar to the benchmarking diagrams that Christina was describing. So you can look across your 6 fields from left to right, or you can look for one particular field, whether all the nutrients are low in relation to everybody else if you look down for one field. And so I find this when I'm working with groups of farmers, and groups of farmers have really taken this up so that they can compare with each other locally. I find it works remarkably well, and very often we can pick up one particular nutrient that's a problem on one farm, or one particular field that was possibly poorly rooted. And then at the end of the winter, we're doing this at the moment for 2021, we'll produce a seasonal summary to show how nutrient levels were for that season compared with all previous seasons. If I now go on to Yen Zero started a year later, so just last year, as a pilot, and it's sort of fully fledged operation is due to be launched in the next month or so. So what Yen Zero is aiming to do is to build a community that's working to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions from arable cropping, and so it's all about sharing the knowledge through meetings and through newsletters and so on, and at a farm level, estimating what your carbon footprints are and what your carbon intensities are for you. So the higher the yield you get, the more you dilute your carbon footprint. So yield's all part of the calculations, and you can benchmark those, and then eventually we'll be able to test various ideas for mitigating the carbon footprints of these crops. So just if you're interested in that, watch out for announcements in the press, or go onto the Yen website and you'll be able to see up-to-date information about what's available. I just want to lastly come back to this bringing the knowledge together. I mean, the digital age has been fantastic in allowing us to connect with each other so much more efficiently, just as I'm doing now from my new home in the west coast of Scotland. I can talk to you all over the UK and abroad if I want to. So that's fantastic. But somehow we need to have some quality control on the information that we can home in on, so that we can home in on knowledge that we know is trusted. And so what we've been doing is working with a number of collaborators. You know, we're producing a lot of new information via the Yen, but we're also very conscious that there are all sorts of other questions and arenas in agriculture that need to be addressed similarly, and we don't have the capacity to do that. So what we've set up, or what we are setting up, and this is being led by Daniel Kindred in ADAS. So please get in touch with Daniel if you're interested in this, or go on to the Yen website or the Farm Pet website. The address, the URL for the website is there. And we're trying to sort of co-create this website with the industry so that it's presented in the most user-friendly way. But the key element to me of this website is, if you sort of compare it with the Farming Forum, which is part of our consortium that's trying to develop this, the Farming Forum has enabled tens of thousands of farmers to talk to each other all the time, but the information has no quality control. So we've got the concept of quality control coming into this, rather in the way that Wikipedia works, but specifically for agriculture, and for agriculture in the UK to start with. So that's Farm Pep, and that's a fairly new development. So just, it's my job really now to conclude. I'm afraid we've run 10 minutes over time. Big scope to increase yields. That benchmarking must be measuring the factors that control yield, which is what we as scientists bring to the party. We think we know what's known, and therefore what's important to measure to start with about what controls yields, and we can help you do that. We have, you know, because we do it every season, you can take the seasonal factor out when you take your measurements, because you can compare with everybody else from the same season. You can, because we go through the whole season in the way Christina's described, you can deduce which part of the season seems to be going wrong. Grain analysis has proved amazingly useful, and obviously it's compared with soil analysis, it is the direct way of measuring success in nutrient capture. Because we've got hundreds of farms involved, we can start seeing these. This is, from my point of view, the real attraction for the whole operation. We can start seeing these patterns and these farm factors that really we didn't appreciate were so big and so consistent. So we need to really redirect our research to understand the farm factor, and we really need to be working with farmers, as many as possible, to try and understand what is controlling these farm-to-farm variations to bring lower yielding farms up to higher yielding farm levels. So there's also all the capacity to test things, but we haven't got time to go into that. If you're interested in joining the yen, then you need to appreciate that it's entirely an industry thing at the moment. It's really got virtually no public funding we've received over the 10 years. It's these marvelous sponsoring organizations that have seen the potential of what we've got here and are in many different ways, either through in-kind contributions or through sponsoring entrants. They are helping us to keep the yens on the road. So if you can probably think of an organization, if you don't want to pay for entry yourself, you can think of an organization that might sponsor you, almost certainly. So thank you very much, and I hope we've got some time for questions.
Thank you very much. Excuse me, Roger. That was really interesting, and Christina too. An awful lot of information there, and I think if it was possible to have gone on another 3 hours between the two of you, I'm sure we could. Just following on from Roger's last slide and all the contributors towards yen that we saw within those logos, if anybody would be interested in yen and wants more information, if you follow up with any of your knowledge exchange managers, all our details are on the website. By all means, we will do our best to point you in the right direction if we can't help you ourselves. If I could just invite you all to switch your cameras back on. How many have I got? Gary and Mike, if you would like to join us again. We have got a few questions. I've got one or two that are fairly similar, so I'm hoping that I can collaborate these fairly well. But just to kick off, Christina and Roger, I'll send this one in your direction, but it's just about the labs that you use for the samples that come in. And then on the back of that, regards the yen, who sort of decides the target nutrient levels for the information, and how often do you reassess this?
Yes, well to begin with, we went to the scientific literature and looked in the scientific literature to see what the threshold levels were. A little bit of the work we had done with the AHDB on phosphorus in cereal crops, and it was actually that work that started the whole operation of realizing that grain analysis was a really generally useful thing, because we found that phosphorus levels less than something like 0.32% in the dry matter were associated with the potential to increase yield. So we've got in RB209, it now says you need to check whether your phosphorus level is more than 0.32 or not. And we found that a large proportion of the grains we were analysing were actually quite low. But the more we measure, the more we come to understand what the low levels are in crops, in each crop by crop. So we now actually use the low end of the range for each nutrient for each crop. So we have separate levels for beans, for barley, for wheat, for oats, for peas, and so on, for oilseeds, for linseed. So, well, linseed we haven't got enough yet of, but so we compare linseed with oilseed rape. But most of them we now have a value that we appreciate is low. And actually our data are better, far better than you can get from reading the literature, because a lot of what you get from the literature comes from places like Australia where conditions are very different.
Fab. And then just following on from that, while you're there, if the soil pH is high but grain yen says P is low, how do you correct this?
Sorry, can you say that again? If the
soil P is high but grain
yes.
yen says P is low, how are you going to correct this?
Well, I wish I knew the answer. I'm sorry. I mean, I can make all sorts of suggestions, but we haven't done the research to sort that out, and it is affecting a lot of people. We've got probably something like 30 or 40% of crops are in that situation, and we know that high pH soils are less successful at taking up P. For any particular level of soil P, then high pH soils, the crop is getting less of them, of the P. But there are all sorts of P products that we haven't tested, which have the potential of providing more efficient uptake than what we used as a standard is triple superphosphate, which is very inefficient.
Yeah, so within ADAS, we'd like to now better understand how we get P into the crop by testing these different products and seeing how we can enhance nutrition of P into the crops, because it's a clear indicator from the grain analysis through yen that P is limiting.
Fab. Yeah. And then, Mike, I think this one's coming in your direction. I hope I'm right anyway, but using the tissue analysis, are you tailoring any trace element mixtures to alleviate the deficiencies throughout the season?
Every single one. So T0, T1, T2 and T3 will test before, and then each application will be tailored as part of that application. And I know somebody asked about cost earlier. I forgot to say it was about £15.50 we were paying last season. I don't know how much we're going to be paying this season per test, per sample.
And who are you doing those with?
I think it's land crop, but you can also use NRM. There's quite a few different ones. I'm sure your agronomist will be able to send them off. We ask our agronomist to collect them and send them off for us. And we'll just take a sample field of each block, and then it will be done as a block.
Brilliant, thank you. Roger, back to you. The farm difference, are you saying this is the soil type, location, altitude, etc., or the management on farm?
It could easily be somebody.
Yeah.
So this is about what I'm calling the farm factor, and the range of 5 tons between consistently high yielding and consistently low yielding. I mean, there may be, remember, some farmers are very competitive and they like the competition and they'll put in their best fields, and some will be like Gary and Michael who are putting in a typical field. So that will be some part of the variation, but as far as we've sort of informally tried to think through what the factors are that are accounting for these big differences in yield, and then looked at the sort of agronomy of the successful ones. Particularly, they're involved in making applications more frequently, so there is something physical in the way they actually manage, and that's what's given us this phrase of attention to detail, and why we've got that in the title of this webinar.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Just conscious of time now, and I've got 2 slides to wrap up today. First of all, I mean, Roger, Christina, Gary and Michael, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been really, really informative, and I appreciate your time joining us. Michelle, if you just wouldn't mind dropping onto the last slide, please. We've mentioned throughout this evening about 1 or 2 publications. If anybody would like any of the AHDB publications, if you don't head to our website, they are available through emailing publications@ahdb.org. Please do, there's all sorts of valuable information there. If you would like any more information regards yen, I've said already that if you don't go through to one of your sponsors that we saw on Roger's last page, by all means get in touch with one of your local KEMs, and all their details are available on AHDB's webpage. Alternatively, if that fails, by all means do get in touch with me following this webinar, and I'll do my best to point you in the right direction. The yen entries for yen are currently open at the minute in time, and further details are also available on the ADESC website regards entering those. Just leaves me to finish then. Thank you all again for joining tonight's webinar. Our next webinar is in a month's time, so that's the 6th of April, 7 o'clock again. Tonight's webinar has been recorded, so if you at all missed it or would like to listen back through again, it's available on our archive or the YouTube page. There will be a feedback survey that comes through following this. If you could just take 2 minutes to fill it out, it's always really appreciated. Great to hear what you think, and also what next subjects would be of value to talk about. And like always, if you do have any further questions, by all means, don't hesitate to get in touch with all of us at any point. So that just leaves me to wish you all a good night. Thank you all very much. Thank you for listening, and we'll hopefully join you all again for the next Monitor Farm webinar. Thank you.